The nationalist movements in Europe in the 19th century involved virtually every continental state. Except for the major states of Russia and England, almost every one of the nations in Europe had been convulsed by revolution. And indeed, those revolutions of 1848 proved to be some of the most effective instruments by which the nationalist movements of the 19th century became defined, and in fact became the seed ground from which two of the most important would ultimately grow. From that experience arose those powerful programs of self-determination that created two of the great states of the continent, Germany and Italy, bringing together states that were linked initially by language, culture, and ethnicity, and then ultimately were linked by political organization and structure. Moreover, there were similarities in both of these movements, inasmuch as both happened at approximately the same time, and both enjoyed powerful kingdoms to provide the nucleus of an expanded nation-state, and both benefited from the guidance of a clever and ruthless statesman, someone who could in fact take the advantages inherent in these nuclear states and then expand them in order to include a much broader nation-state. The German Empire emerged in 1871 as one of the great powers of the continent, while Italy emerged in 1861 as a weak but ambitious kingdom whose national mission was still incomplete. Let's look at these two movements of national unification and national self-fulfillment in order to see not just how they were brought about, but also how two very different states were in fact created. Let's start first with Germany. The unification of Germany created one of the most powerful states on the continent, and indeed a state powerful enough to ultimately challenge the established nations of France and Britain. The growth of nationalism in the German-speaking lands was slow, initially manifested in literary and artistic movements, often again among students or liberal politicians. These would meet secretly to discuss nationalist designs, to talk about the dream of a nation which would encompass all Germans. The formation of the German Confederation after the Congress of Vienna had actually reduced the number of German states from nearly 350 before 1789, and of these, 51 were ecclesiastical states and 61 were free cities. But there were just 39 after the Congress of Vienna and the creation of the German Confederation. Napoleon's abolition of the Habsburg Roman Empire, the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire, was confirmed, ending an empire that had begun with Charlemagne, really as an abstraction, as an idea. This ending of the Holy Roman Empire eliminated this abstraction because it had confused the nature and goal of German unity. It shifted the focus away from Austria, and the focus of German culture was increasingly then being focused in Central Europe, whereas Austria began to concentrate more on the eastern Danube provinces. And Prussia in Central Europe began to emerge as the most powerful and the dominant state in the German Confederation. And it's this kingdom, the Kingdom of Prussia, that ultimately would become the nucleus for German unification. Prussia's new prominence and military power precipitated its ambition to become the leader of the German people, replacing the Austrians that had assumed that role for so long in that abstraction known as the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, the path to unification was aided by the struggle between Austria and Prussia to control the German Confederation, because there was a new focus, there was a new intensity towards a real state, a state with an effective bureaucracy, an army, and also an ambition to create a modern state, one that was to reflect all of the ambitions of 19th century European ideology. The first steps towards the creation of a unified German state were small and practical rather than romantic and heroic. And this was the establishment of the Zollverein in 1833-34. The Zollverein is simply a customs union that allowed for free trade among the members of the Confederation. Customs unions are hardly heroic and hardly romantic, but in many ways they are necessary because they provide a common bond, a cement that will link people in ways that affect them almost most importantly. That is their pocketbook, where things are determined by the economic relations of individual to individual, group to group, corporation to corporation, and there was a body to oversee this. Although this was an economic measure, it reinforced Prussian leadership over the Confederation and would further undermine the influence of Austria. The The Zollverein established high tariff barriers, tying together the loose confederation and giving further impetus to nationalist sentiments. In Germany, as we saw in the last lecture, the revolutions that had broken out in 1848 were largely driven by German liberals, many of them from the Southwest, and these met in the city of Heidelberg to call for changes to the German Confederation, to try and restructure what had emerged from the Congress of Vienna. The goal was not to overthrow the rulers of the German states, but rather to transform Germany by using the Confederation's Diet that met in the city of Frankfurt to unite the various parts of the German-speaking lands. The Diet was intended to create a unified Germany through peaceful, liberal legislation and negotiation. These, after all, were not just nationalists. They were also liberals who believed in principles of fairness and equity, and they believed that rational debate could solve the problems that they faced. But the reality was that the Frankfurt Parliament didn't have the power to unite these various states. Moreover, many of the individual German rulers were extremely nervous about the Frankfurt Assembly, and especially about this assembly legislating for their subjects. They feared the loss of their own authority, turning over what they saw as their autonomy to the Frankfurt Diet and the Confederation. Also, the attempt to define the rights of Germans seems somewhat too liberal to many of those more conservative members of the German population, because these included basic liberal principles such as an end to class privileges, an end to censorship, an end to arbitrary arrest, and equality under the law. We're going to see continually the relationship between liberalism and nationalism and how they often work closely together, at least initially. And we're also going to see that in many ways, these are different principles looking for different conclusions, and they're having different dreams. But initially, one reinforced the other in order to effect change, because both nationalists and liberals were looking for change. In Prussia, King Frederick William IV accepted in principle these national objectives, but he also made very little effort to enforce them. Also, the liberals in the Prussian National Assembly, aware of the national aspirations of other peoples within German-speaking lands, ambitions that paralleled their own, felt it only fair and just to grant them a measure of self-determination as well. Because after all, if the Germans were going to enjoy self-determination, why shouldn't those other peoples within the German-speaking lands have the same right? Again, these people were not only nationalists, but liberals. This was the case particularly for the Poles within Prussia. The liberal nationalists were prepared to grant Prussian Poland some measure of self-government. But in a parallel that we can see with the situation of Bohemia in 1848, the German minority in Poland revolted. They revolted against any plan to extend freedom to Polish Prussia. And Prussian troops were called in order to end the danger that this experiment in Polish self-government would have had for the German minority in that area. So the entry of a Prussian army into German-speaking Poland ended any hope of self-government. Moreover, that same army, having finished their work there, then moved on to Berlin in order to suppress the 1848 revolutionary movement that had overtaken the capital as well, suppressing, in fact, the entire 1848 movement in the Kingdom of Prussia. In the end, the Prussian liberal revolutionary experiment failed, a victim of the traditions of militarism and authoritarianism that had shaped Prussia's evolution as a state. It was equally a victim of that inherent contradiction that I mentioned, that contradiction that constantly emerged between liberal and nationalist principles. Despite the very best of intentions of working together, there are in fact very different goals: the desire for self-determination and the desire for liberal rights. So the liberal nationalists were in fact at the beginning willing to effect change by cooperation, but then ultimately when they had to choose between either national or liberal goals, they would then divide according to their fundamental principles. Although the revolutions of 1848 had failed, liberalism was in fact spreading and nationalism was becoming a force that would be very difficult to control. In Germany, those national aspirations would be directed by Prince Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian First Minister since 1862, a position that he would actually hold not only in Prussia but in the German Empire for the next 28 years. Bismarck's obsession, his obsession was really to create a united Germany under Prussian leadership. And moreover, under Prussian leadership, a German state would be formed that would exclude Austria. While it was by no means an easy task, Bismarck and Prussia had clear advantages. Bismarck was working with the foundations of a powerful German state that was already in place, within the defined borders and institution of the Confederation. All that was required for turning this loose confederation into a centralized monarchy, linked as it was with language and culture, was a central government and an army. Of course, Bismarck had the Prussian army at his disposal, and he would use it to bring together the German states into a German nation, ruled by his master, the Prussian king, William I. Well, who was Bismarck, and why was he so skillful in turning this set of advantages into an effective policy that ultimately created modern Germany? Well, Bismarck was a Prussian Junker, a great landowner of vast estates in East Prussia, a man produced by that militarist and authoritarian tradition that had animated Prussia from at least the time of Frederick the Great. Moreover, he was a model practitioner of Realpolitik, that very pragmatic policy, not based on any broad ethical or moral precepts, but one in which the ends justified the means. His attitudes, I think, are reflected in his statement that Germans have to choose between guns and butter, and it was clear which he was advocating. Power before comfort, sacrifice before pleasure. First, Bismarck sought to undermine the German Confederation to make Prussia the dominant power in North Germany. This was done by drawing Austria into an alliance to wage war against the Danes in 1864 over the North European province of Schleswig-Holstein. Victory meant that both Prussia and Austria were ceded rights to the North German territories. But then, Bismarck and Prussia moved against their former ally, Austria, in 1866. After convincing Napoleon III of France to remain neutral in any war between Prussia and Austria, Bismarck precipitated a crisis with Austria over the governing of Schleswig-Holstein. War broke out in 1866. The Austrian armies were defeated, and Bismarck was able to isolate Austria from German politics and succeed in uniting all of the North German states under Prussia as the North German Confederation. Subsequently, Bismarck, to co-opt the liberals and draw them into his nationalist ambitions once more, established a constitution with the lower house of the assembly elected by universal manhood suffrage, a remarkable moment. This step galvanized the cooperation of the liberals and the socialists who now supported Prussia, despite its militaristic traditions. They were willing to give Bismarck the benefit of the doubt. He, in fact, had done something they had all been demanding, and he had done so freely: universal manhood suffrage. And it seemed as though Prussia was about to become a state in which liberal principles were to be instituted and which they were to be protected. But Bismarck still had to unite the southern states. He had done so in the north, and now he had to bring the southern German states into this confederation. But the southern states were very wary of Prussian power, and they distrusted Bismarck. So Bismarck again was able to use war to accomplish his goals, this time creating a crisis with France over the future of the Spanish throne. The Franco-Prussian War witnessed, as we've seen, Napoleon III's armies defeated and the collapse of his Second Empire. A united German Empire was proclaimed, with Wilhelm of Prussia becoming the Emperor William I in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles on the 18th of June, 1871. A great moment of irony that the great palace built by Louis XIV, that palace which was to symbolize French power and French cultural domination, was a site for the creation of a German empire, an empire that was to challenge France, not culturally, but that was to challenge France militarily, economically, and politically, to be the most powerful state on the continent. The unification of Italy emerged at almost exactly the same time, but as with all things Italian, it was not without romance and drama. The unification movement is known as the Risorgimento, the resurgence, a resurgence of Italian national feeling and the resurgence of Italian nationhood. And, as with Germany, it was led by a powerful state, the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, and a brilliant statesman, Conte Camillo Benso di Cavour. The Italians hadn't known political unity since the fall of the Roman Empire, except for a brief and largely fictional vice-regency under Napoleon. However, those Italians who had experienced the Enlightenment, who had felt the impact of the French Revolution and Napoleon's control over the country, began to feel that their political fate should be in their own hands, rather than those of foreign oppressors such as the Austrians, who had controlled much of Italy for the past 3 centuries. The Austrians, moreover, had ruled Italy with vicious repression, and the nationalist movements in the Italian territories under their control were consequently secret societies and conspiratorial organizations. They couldn't be public, it was illegal, and so they had to meet in secret places in order to conspire against the Austrian state. The most significant of these were the Carbonari, which means in Italian the charcoal burners. They took their name because they would meet secretly at night and they would huddle around the copper braziers that would provide heat to Italian bedrooms. And they would use this light and heat in order to talk about national unity and to plan how they were going to create ultimately a state for the Italian people. And there was Giovane Italia, Young Italy, founded in 1831 by Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini, again, a very interesting man, was heavily influenced by the socialist utopianism of Saint-Simon, whom we will meet in a subsequent lecture. Mazzini was committed to the unification of Italy as a secular republic. And he also, in an age before spin doctors and 30-second sound bites, had a gift for self-promotion and also for the promotion of his cause. For example, he always wore black, and because he spent much of his life in exile, he was asked in England why he always wore black, and his response was, "Because I am in mourning for my nation." That's the sort of thing you remember, and it's the sort of thing that begins to unite the idea of Italy in the mind of foreigners as well as Italians. His nationalist message was very, very well received. It was embraced by liberal nobles and middle-class intellectuals. But his republicanism alienated them. Most of the intellectual class, especially since there was a very close association between the liberal aristocracy and the professional classes like journalists and professors and teachers, most of these preferred a constitutional monarchy, led by one of the larger states on the peninsula, working from an existing government apparatus. After all, if you're going to create a state, you have to have somebody to run it. There were several candidates for the nucleus of this united Italy, and there was even a proposal, in fact, for a federated state under the presidency of the Pope, an idea that appealed to nationalist Catholics, but hardly anyone else, especially since the Pope was the reactionary Pius IX, who had suppressed liberalism so effectively after the 1848-49 revolution. The powerful state that most Italians identified as being the most appropriate and what would be the most effective as the catalyst for the unification of Italy was the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, ruled by King Victor Emmanuel II of the House of Savoy, whose chief minister was Camillo di Cavour. After the revolutions of 1848, the kingdom possessed a liberal parliamentary democracy, which guaranteed civil rights, something that impressed those Italians mightily who were living under the heavy hand of the Austrians, and those within the ultra-reactionary Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which is the contemporary name for the kingdom south of Rome that included the island of Sicily and Naples and the south. This Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was ruled by the incompetent Bourbons of Naples. Piedmont-Sardinia had fought a war to drive out the Austrians in 1848-49 as part of this revolutionary period, but failed to do so. The king, Victor Emmanuel II, had come to terms with Austria and followed a moderate conservative path. He was wary of the radicals, while at the same time needing them in order to provide some of the energy for the movement of national unification. And he continued to work for the success of this nationalist movement, but on terms that would be managed and controlled by not only the House of Savoy, but by his minister Cavour. In 1854, Piedmont-Sardinia agreed to join France and Britain in the Crimean War against Russia. This was a pointless thing to do. There was no Italian advantage whatsoever in this war, but it was hoped that by joining the great powers, there would be support amongst them for Italian unity. However, it was too early. There was no interest in undoing the arrangements of the Congress of Vienna at that point, so Sardinia received nothing from the 1856 peace. But just 2 years later, in 1858, Napoleon III, supported by the Sardinians, agreed to undertake a war against Austria to drive her from northern Italy. Venetia, that is the former territories of the Venetian Republic on the Italian mainland, and Lombardy, the northern territory ruled from Milan. In exchange, France would receive the territories of Nice and Savoy, which were then part of Victor Emmanuel's kingdom. And so we must remember that the French city of Nice on the Côte d'Azur was, until the 1850s, the Italian city of Nizza. But Pope Pius IX and the French Roman Catholics warned Napoleon III that what he was doing was aiding what they described as a liberal, secular monarchy. And these would support liberal, secular principles in Italy that would weaken the Roman Catholic Church, which of course had its headquarters in Rome. Napoleon was nervous about this, and with good reason. He needed Catholic support in France at this stage of his imperial rule. So he took the warnings from the Pope seriously, and he withdrew from the war. Piedmont Sardinia then was forced to sign the Peace of Villafranca in 1859. And this peace did not give Piedmont Sardinia all of the territory that it anticipated. But nevertheless, it still was an important moment, because it permitted Victor Emmanuel to annex Lombardy, and very soon after, Tuscany, Parma, and Modena, as well as part of the Papal States. With this, the House of Savoy ruled most of central and northern Italy, with the exception of Venetia, which still remained under the Austrians, and the south of Italy remained in the hands of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The situation in the south, though, was extraordinary, because it was dominated by a remarkable adventurer and patriot, a remarkable human being, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi had spent much of his life fighting for freedom and for national liberation. He had fought in the wars of South America in liberation against Spain. He had, in fact, acquired the dress of a gaucho, which he usually wore. He acquired an Argentinian servant. He was very much part of that revolutionary movement that had swept across Europe and had been then transported across the ocean to try and liberate other peoples as well. And when he returned to Europe, he realized that his destiny was to fight for the liberty of his own people, the Italians. With just 1,000 volunteers dressed in red shirts in order to identify themselves, they had no uniforms, Garibaldi landed in Sicily and succeeded in defeating the incompetent and hated Bourbons, driving the forces of King Francesco II from the island. Garibaldi and his volunteers then crossed the Straits of Messina, landing near Naples, where the peasantry had already rebelled against the king. He continued to Naples, where he was greeted as a conquering hero. The young king, Francesco, an obsessively pious but completely ineffectual ruler, had already left the city, and Garibaldi proclaimed himself dictator. It's important to note here that Garibaldi was not an agent of the House of Savoy, and his ambition was not for personal power. He was not interested in being the ruler of this territory. He was a romantic nationalist leader of the Italian people. He was a kind of a professional revolutionary, fighting for liberal and national rights. Consequently, he was convinced that he should cede Naples in the south to Victor Emmanuel to be united with the rest of the peninsula into a single kingdom that would comprise most of the Italian people. Also, there was a risk of civil war if he would not. And Victor Emmanuel made some promises to Garibaldi that ultimately he did not keep, especially promises that again had a liberal quality. Land reform, to break up the huge estates in the south so that the peasants could have some measure of territory to till of their own. On the 26th of October 1860, Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel met in Naples, and Garibaldi saluted him as the first king of Italy, although the Italian kingdom was not yet officially proclaimed and would not be until the next year. Venice wouldn't be united with the rest of the peninsula until after 1866, following the defeat of the Austrians by the Prussians in the 7 Weeks' War. It's ironic, then, that one of the conditions for the armistice in that war, brought about by Bismarck's maneuvering to unite Germany, assisted as well the creation of the Italian state. Well, Italy was still not completely united. The territory in the north, the Alto Adige and the Trentino, South Tyrol, still formed part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the territory that was most wanted, most desired, in fact was part of the national dream, was Rome. The unification of Italy would be always incomplete until the national dream was fulfilled and Rome was its capital. The final campaign of the Risorgimento then was the capture of the city of Rome and the unification of what was then left of the states of the church into the Italian kingdom. Rome was the natural capital of the new kingdom. Until Rome was captured, the capital had moved from Turin to Florence, but everyone was waiting until Rome could finally be added to the Italian national state and become the perpetual capital of the Italian people, uniting the memory of the Roman Empire, the universal dominion of the church, with the dreams and ambitions of the Italians themselves. But the Pope was in no mood to cooperate. The Pope was the rigorously reactionary Pius IX. He refused to yield to the new Kingdom of Italy, and he remained protected by a French army that had garrisoned the city since the revolutions of 1848-49. The Pope had been restored, in fact, by a French army in 1849 in order to reestablish the independence of the Roman Church, and that army of Napoleon III had remained. But when the French were mobilized to fight in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, Pius IX found himself with no defense against the new Italian kingdom. Once more, German and Italian national unification co-conspired. Still refusing to cede Rome despite the overwhelming power of the Kingdom of Italy, and refusing to cede what was left of the Papal States to the new United Italy, Pius IX mobilized his tiny army of Swiss Guards and zealously Catholic volunteers. And volunteers came from all over the Catholic world. One of the largest groups consisted of French-Canadian Zouaves who traveled in order to protect the Church and the Pope from what they saw as a secular kingdom. When doing so, though, when mobilizing his army, the Pope said that no blood was to be shed in defense of the Church. And in this, he must be considered something of a hero. And indeed, there was very, very little bloodshed, only a very small number of casualties, as the Italian troops broke through the papal defenses at the Porta Pia, that gate that was Michelangelo's last completed work. And on the 20th of September, 1870, Rome was captured, completing the dream of Italian national unity, making the Eternal City part of the Italian nation and its capital. Rome was then turned into this capital, but the Pope refused to recognize his defeat. The Pope, in fact, used his spiritual power to try and alienate Italian Catholics from the Kingdom of Italy. There was a decree of anathema against any Italian who held public office, who would vote in elections, who recognized the existence of the Kingdom of Italy. Pius IX himself locked himself in the Apostolic Palace, and he and his successors were to remain the prisoners of the Vatican, those self-defined prisoners who were then the prisoners of the Italian state. They saw the church as being overtaken, as being kind of nationalized by the Italian state, which indeed did prove itself to be both liberal and secular. This agreement, this impasse was not ended until the agreement that was finally reached with Mussolini's fascist government in 1929. And up until then, there was a very, very sharp demarcation between those Italians of conscience who were devout Roman Catholics and those who were nationalists supporting the Italian kingdom. It was an unfortunate situation and indeed helped give rise to fascism. The victory in the Italian and German movements of unification represented, as we've seen then, the effective use of power to achieve national goals. There was very little concern for ethics, principles, or religion. Witness the treatment of the papacy and the church by the new Kingdom of Italy. In the next lectures, we're going to see the justification for some of these actions. We're going to see how some of these policies were then turned into extensions of a belief system that was driven by science, a belief system that allowed for the application of Darwinian theory and social Darwinism for political and social and economic ends. The unification principles then of Germany and Italy were part of the nationalist fervor that swept the entire continent in the middle years of the 19th century. But then they became closely associated not just with liberalism, but with other ideas that gave them even more vigor and a sharpness. And once you start defining yourself in terms of national identification, you become exclusive. You begin to define yourself as what you are not. There is the distinction between self and other. There is the struggle for the resources of the continent. There is the struggle for empire, the struggle for power. These then cease to be only the reflection of the traditional ideas of dominance. They become increasingly the reflection of ideas of Darwinian social survival of the fittest and natural selection. And this proved to be truly dangerous for the entire continent.